Hey everybody! First video of chapter 21. We are going to build on what you know about chromosomes and genes, and we're going to move right into some terminology. So a genotype is essentially a characterization of the genes that you have, okay? So your genotype is really referring to the exact variants or alleles that you have at your gene. The gene is on a spot on a chromosome, and that spot is called the locus. The alternate variations, if you will, of the gene are called alleles. So, example from the book, you can have a brown-eyed allele or you can have a blue-eyed allele. So your genotype is going to be essentially what are you carrying at that locus. Now remember, you are diploid, so you have a chromosome 1 from mom and a chromosome 1 from dad and 2 and 2 and so on. So you have two copies of all of your autosomes. So it takes these two to come together to make your genotype. Let's look at some examples. So a genotype, again, is going to refer to these alleles. You can have the dominant allele or you can have the recessive allele. Or you can have both. The dominant allele is referred to the one that masks the effect of the recessive allele. So if you have brown eyes and you know that you have a blue-eyed parent, then you likely have a blue-eyed allele that's being masked by the brown-eyed allele, and that's why you show brown eyes. Now, if you're a blue-eyed individual, you are recessive, and it takes two recessive alleles to show that recessive genotype, blue eyes. Okay. So there's different ways to have dominance, but there's only one way to have the recessive. So let's take a look at these terms. Homozygous dominant means you have two copies of the dominant allele. So then you would have this dominant condition, the brown eyes. So your genotype is big A, or homozygous dominant. You can be homozygous recessive, so you're going to be, for example, little a, and then you're going to have this recessive condition. So that would be the blue eyes. Heterozygous is a situation where you have one of each. So you have one capital or one dominant allele and one recessive allele. So you're just heterozygous. No heterozygous dominant or something like that. It's just heterozygous. So let's see how this might look. Here are some eggs. This particular egg has one dominant A allele. This egg has the recessive little a allele, and this one has a dominant A allele. Sperm here are slightly different. So the first sperm, a dominant allele, can fuse with this egg and make a genotype of big A, or we call that homozygous dominant. Here we have the egg with the recessive allele, little a, sperm little a, so the offspring are going to be homozygous recessive. And then here we have essentially one of each, big A, little a, and now we have the heterozygous condition. This is actually showing us the genetic inheritance of albinism. So when we refer to a phenotype, that's really the interpretation of the genotype. So, for example, brown eyes is a phenotype. Blue eyes is a phenotype. Being a tongue roller is a phenotype. Having a widow's peak is a phenotype. Having breast cancer is a phenotype. BRCA1 gene, and what you code for that gene is going to be a genotype. Whether you carry the big W or little w for widow's peak, that's the genotype. So the phenotype is the physical expression. So it's a word, it's not the letters. The genotype then is going to direct and dictate the phenotype. So let's take a look a little closer at just these traits that involve, these genetics problems that involve just one trait. So we're looking at just eye color, or just freckles, or just pigmentation for normal or albinism. We're not going to look at hair color plus eye color. That would be a two-trait cross. So we're going to take a look at this condition. The one trait or the monohybrid cross condition is going to involve freckles. So two parents without freckles have children. So a dominant capital F refers to having the dominant allele for freckles. I have freckles. Or the little f is referring to the recessive allele of no freckles. So we see here on this figure that on the left-hand side, the girl has freckles. We do not know whether she is actually homozygous dominant, big F, or whether she's a heterozygous, big F, little f, right? You don't know. you'd have to maybe look at our parents. And so now you would start to take a look at a pedigree or a family tree, if you will. On the right-hand side, this young boy is little f, little f. He has no freckles. So he is homozygous recessive. Okay, so now if we take a look at how this results. So if I'm a male and I have no freckles, then my gametes, my sperm, are only going to carry the little f allele. If I am a female and I have no freckles, my eggs are only going to carry this little f allele. So little f from the sperm fertilizing the little f from the egg, then now you have all your offspring are going to be little f, little f. And instead of saying that, we say homozygous recessive. So all your offspring have no freckles. But you know what? That's not always the case. Here's a case where we have a male who happens to be homozygous dominant for freckles, big F, and having children with a woman with no freckles. So he can only give the big F and she can only give the little f. And when they come together, then you're going to have offspring that are heterozygous. So all their kids have freckles. Now, to make this easier for us, because we can get into what we call two hybrid crosses. So maybe I have freckles, but I carry the recessive allele, and my spouse has freckles and carries a recessive allele, then now we're both heterozygotes. So now it's going to get a little trickier to think about all our possible offspring. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to create a square, and on one side of the square, left or top, however you want to look at it, we are going to put the possible alleles for the sperm. And on the other side, or I'm thinking on top, I'm going to put the possible alleles for the eggs. And now we can just pair up the alleles in a box. So let's take a look. Here are my heterozygous parents, big F, little f. Okay. Now we've taken essentially the possible alleles for the woman's eggs. So she's not going to give both of these because in meiosis, big F separates from little f. And in meiosis in the male, big F is going to separate from little f unless there's non-disjunction. So now we can take a look. Okay, in this particular square, above it is an F, capitalized, to the left, capitalized F. So this particular offspring would be big F, or homozygous dominant. Now we are going to move this F over to this box and bring down the little f. This particular individual is going to be heterozygous. Now, in this particular square, we bring the big F down from the top of this column. Just skip this square above it. Big F, and then little f. Lastly, little f, little f. So what do we see here? We see that with these two heterozygote individuals, that we can have children that are homozygous dominant, that are heterozygous, and homozygous recessive. So then we start to ask ourselves, okay, so how many of their children are going to have freckles and how many are not? So these, as you remember, these combinations of these letters represents the genotype. Now we need to interpret what is the phenotype. If big F is dominant, then that means that an individual is going to have freckles. So this individual has freckles. This individual has freckles. This one has freckles. This one does not. So out of our 4 squares, 3 of the 4, 3/4 or 75% of our children will have freckles. 1/4 of our children will not have freckles. Sorry for the interruption. So you get the idea here that you can have parents with a dominant phenotype, and they are actually heterozygous. And when you have 2 heterozygous individuals, then you can have a mixture of the offspring. So here we have one individual that's actually homozygous dominant, one individual child. We have 2 that are heterozygous, 2/4, 50%, and then 1/4 that would actually be non-freckled. So that would be homozygous recessive. Pause here if you want to read this. This is what I just said. Okay, so we do have genetic disorders that either follow this autosomal dominant either follow a dominant autosomal genetic disorder. So that means that the individual, if they have just one copy of that dominant allele, they are going to be affected. So that would be homozygous dominant or heterozygous. And then the other condition is autosomal recessive. So this is like the genetics we've been talking about so far, like freckles being recessive. So the only way that you can have this autosomal recessive disorder is if you have 2 of those recessive alleles or homozygous recessive. So how do we figure that out? We figure it out by doing a pedigree. So this is where you can start to get a look at familial relationships and go down through the generations and identify those individuals that have the genetic disorder or don't. This is what it might look like. Circles represent women or females. Squares represent males. If you have the disorder, and then they color that in. So pattern 1 on the left of this figure shows us that the male and female, neither one of them have the disorder, but they have a child that has it. So that's going to tell you, oh, this seems a lot more like 2 freckled individuals having a child with no freckles. So this would be autosomal recessive. Pattern 2, both parents are affected, but they have an unaffected child. So what this tells us is that the 2 parents either are homozygous dominant or heterozygous. It only took one dominant allele to be affected, but they can have an unaffected child because they themselves can carry the recessive allele, but they have the disorder. So it's going to take a little thinking maybe about how that goes. Okay, when we have an autosomal recessive type of inheritance, that heterozygote, that individual that is carrying a recessive allele, the recessive allele causing the disorder or the affliction, then that individual has a special name called carrier. We don't usually use carrier for a heterozygous individual with brown eyes, right? Who cares whether you carry a little blue recessive allele? So carrier is a particular name for a heterozygote of someone that is carrying the autosomal recessive allele. Okay, so again, this follows the pattern like with freckles or with brown eyes and blue eyes, that it is a homozygous recessive individual that has the condition. We have some very commonly known and studied and even clinically able to ID and diagnose some autosomal recessive disorders. So one of those is Tay-Sachs disease. So it's a fairly rare disease in the world population, but it is much higher in a particular subgroup of Jewish populations and their descendants. So essentially you can see here it results from a lack of a lysosome enzyme called HEX-A. So HEX-A, for those of us with the normal condition, clears out fatty acid proteins in the brain. So if you don't have HEX-A, then it means that you have the accumulation of this fatty acid in the brain. The terrible thing about Tay-Sachs disease is you would have a child that would be normally developing at 9 months, 10, 11, 12, meeting all the milestones, and then shortly after a year, 18 months, this child then is going to be retrogressing. So essentially, or regressing. They're going to simply stop being able to do the things that all the milestones they had met, and they go back to not being able to do those things. Generally, children that are affected by this disease will die by the age of 5. Cystic fibrosis, another autosomal recessive disorder, affects 1 in 29 individuals, and it's actually caused by a defective chloride channel. And this chloride channel makes sure that it's essentially maintaining the tonicity, if you will, of the tubes of the bronchial tubes and the cells are surrounding it. So there's a thick mucus that builds up not only in the bronchial tubes, but in the pancreatic ducts because of the ineffective ability to deal with excess chlorine. Sickle cell anemia, another autosomal recessive disorder. Essentially, this one causes the red blood cells to become sickle-shaped. And essentially what they do is they can't pass through the capillaries, and it causes severe pain. Not only pain, but jaundice, anemia, as you might imagine, tissue damage, and gallstones. The strange thing about this one is if you are a heterozygote, you can see that your red blood cells are normal unless you're dehydrated or oxygen deprived. So you can look normal. But under those conditions, it can cause that condition to be flared up. And it's caused by an abnormal hemoglobin that differs by only one single amino acid. So sickle cell anemia tend to be more prevalent in African Americans, and definitely a disease that we need to be keeping an eye on.